Okay, Claire, I'm continuing to elect people in, but it is 2 minutes past 6, I think now.
Okay, great. So welcome everybody to our meeting this evening from the Wiltshire Governors Association. It is a real pleasure to welcome you this evening to what I hope will be an informative and interesting evening for you. My name is Claire Tunnicliffe and I chair the Wiltshire Governors Association. Tonight, we are really pleased to welcome Grant from Wiltshire Council, who's going to give us an overview of what's happening in the financial space for us as governors, which will be very much on our worry bead list at the moment. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of some of what's happening in the WTA space. Just to let you know that we're actually recording this evening's meeting because some of our colleagues who couldn't necessarily be here tonight were very interested in what we were talking about and asked if we could record it for them to be able to view it later. Also, as I say, if you could mute yourselves just so there isn't a lot of background noise. I'm sure we're all used to this now in this way of working. When Grant is presenting, he's really happy to take questions as he goes. Please just pop them into the chat window and then he will be able to pick them up from there. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Grant and let him tell us what's happening in the finance space. So thank you very much, Grant.
Thank you, Claire. That's very kind, and thank you for the introduction. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for giving it your time this evening to come along to this session. I know finance can sometimes be a bit of a dry topic, so we'll try and keep it as cheerful as we can do. And there are some good news messages in here as well to give out this evening. So we'll have quite a quick canter through the world of school funding. Claire, can we have the next slide, please? So in terms of what we're going to cover off for the session, I thought I'd do a quick introduction to Wiltshire, just give you a few stats just to warm everyone up and get you sort of into the Wiltshire way. Then we talk about some funding, a bit on high needs as well, budget planning for next year. Yes, we'll soon be in next year. And then just a few updates in some other areas too. So that's what we're going to cover off this evening. So if any of you have come for health and safety, you're in the wrong place, I'm afraid. Okay, can we have the next slide then, please, Claire? So I thought we'd start off this evening.
I can't hear you. Can anybody hear me?
I can hear you, Nigel. Yes, I can hear you. Can you not hear us? I'm assuming he can't. Nigel, can you hear me? I don't think that Nigel can hear us. I'm gonna, thank you. Okay, I'm going to continue because we've got quite a few slides to get through this evening, and hopefully Nigel will be able to hear us very soon. So in terms of pupil numbers, I just thought it'd be interesting to share with you some statistics from Wiltshire in terms of pupil numbers over the last few years. And I've got the figures in here broken down by primary and then Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. Going back to 2015-16, and these are the numbers of pupils that we were funding in Wiltshire during that period. And we can see that we started off back 5 years ago with 59,774 pupils, and we're now up over 64,000 pupils. So that's quite a change over that period. So you can see where the main growth has been. We've had an increase in primary pupils over that period, as well as in secondary pupils. And what we're seeing is that rate of increase, which was up at 800 a year, 1,000 a year, 500 a year, is dropping off. And you can see we're only actually funding 84 more pupils in Wiltshire for next year compared to the current year. So that's really slowed off, that growth has. Claire, can we have the next slide, please? Claire, could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so I thought also it'd be useful to share with you just some birth rate data. And this is indicative of where things are going at the moment. So We can see in there the primary school numbers by year group as of October 20 in the first part of this table. And you can see there the number of pupils in from reception year 1, year 2, all the way through to year 6. And they're all above 5,000 in terms of the numbers in there. When we then go to look at the birth rate data, which we collect from Virgin Care, who collect all the birth rate data across the county, you can see that the number of births in Wiltshire is actually declining and has been declining over the last couple of years, so that we can now see, if we look into 2017 in our data, we can see that the birth rate has dropped off to below 5,000 a year. So we're now down at 4,800, 4,700, 4,600 births a year. And the reason for sharing this with you is just to give you an indication that if the birth rate is dropping like this, this could have an impact for our pupil numbers coming into our primaries, you know, in 4 or 5 years' time as those numbers feed through. So it's just to make you aware that we are seeing a demographic shift in Wiltshire, a decline in the birth rate at the moment. So it's just making you aware of that. Can we have the next slide, please, Claire? Okay, so just a quick update. How many schools have we got in Wiltshire? We've currently got 202 primary schools, 29 secondary schools and 4 special schools. There's no new schools that we're planning to open in September this year, and we didn't open any in September last year either. In terms of closed schools or closing schools, we did close Lippiat Primary School back in August 2019, and the Salisbury UTC closed last August, both for very different reasons, but there are no planned school closures going forward. The only other reorganisation, just to make you aware of, is that 3 of our special schools, that's Radford Special School, St Nicholas in Chippenham and Larkrise in Trowbridge, have all come together to create one new school called Silverwood School, and that happened from September last year. So that's now one school operating over 3 sites. Can we have the next slide, please, Claire? Okay, so in terms of the breakdown of the schools, what we've got is we've got 120 maintained primary schools, 4 maintained secondary schools, 82 primary academies and 25 secondary academy schools. So you can see the bulk of the secondary schools have moved across to academy. In terms of our special schools, you can see we've now got 4 across the county, 2 maintained and 2 academy ones, but there are plans for a new free special school in the south of the county. The plans are for that new special school to be built on the site of the UTC in Salisbury, which is where the old police headquarters used to be out on the Wilton Road. We've also got resource spaces in the county at 18 of our primary schools, and we've also got ELP provision, that's the enhanced learning provision, at 27 of our secondary schools. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? Okay, so you just go back at one. Schools Forum. I was just quickly going to touch on Schools Forum, and there's 1 or 2 of you that are in the group tonight who are members of Schools Forum. But I just thought I'd make you aware of what the role of Schools Forum is. Schools Forum is the body that make all the funding decisions for our schools in Wiltshire, and it comprises of members from head teachers. It comprises members from our early years settings, from our post-16 settings, that's Wiltshire College, also from our special school sector, the Wiltshire Governors Association have representatives on there as well as the diocese have reps too. And what do? They make decisions about school funding going forward. So all the decisions we make about school funding have to be passed through Schools Forum. And when do they meet? They usually meet 5 times during the course of the year. Usually the most exciting times are December and January when we're sorting out the school budgets for the ensuing year. And I've put a link in there to the Schools Forum papers because they are quite interesting to look at. Schools Forum is a public meeting. You are all welcome to attend. The next one is Thursday this week. Again, you're welcome to attend. It will be a virtual meeting like the one we're having tonight. So please don't feel afraid to join into that meeting. The access there can be gained through the link in the slides when they come out. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? So in terms of school funding, I thought I'd just update you on where we are with the Dedicated Schools Grant. So the Dedicated Schools Grant is the grant that funds all of our schools. It's actually broken down into 4 blocks. We've got the schools block, a central services block, high needs block, and early years block. And you can see in the slide there that they together comprise the Dedicated Schools Grant. In terms of post-16 funding for our secondary schools, that's actually sits outside the Dedicated Schools Grant, and that money comes through from a different different form of funding. And similarly, pupil premium comes through as a separate grant, and obviously that's targeting at those vulnerable pupils. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? Okay, so what's the schools block for? That's the one we're here to talk about tonight in the main. Schools block is the block that funds all of our mainstream schools. So that's our primaries and secondary schools across the county. Then the central block, which is a much smaller block, is a block there that covers all of the centrally provided services by the local authority for all schools, okay, not just maintained schools, all schools, academy schools too. So the local authority has the role of looking after the admissions for all of our schools, providing strategic property guidance and direction and planning for the whole county, and also running school funding for the whole county as well. Then we've got the high needs block. The high needs block covers all of our special schools, covers all of our resource spaces, ELP provision, that's the enhanced learning provision in our secondary schools, named pupil allowances in all of our schools, SEN support teams, and everything to do with SEN across the county. We then have our early years block. Early years block covers our nurseries and early years settings, funding for 2-year-olds and then 3- and 4-year-olds as well in those settings. And each block has a separate formula to calculate how much money that the local authority will receive through that dedicated schools grant. And if we want to transfer funding between any of the blocks at all, then we have to get a special permission to do that from Schools Forum. We have to agree with Schools Forum that we're allowed to move money between the blocks. And for the current year we're in, and also for next year, there's been agreement to transfer 0.5% from the schools block to the high needs block to help support the costs of providing high needs education in the county. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? Thank you. So what sort of money are we talking about? Well, I thought it might be quite interesting just to share the numbers with you. These are huge figures. So the schools block is £317 million. That's the biggest block, and that's what funds all of your schools this evening. The central block for those centrally provided services, you can see, is just over £2.5 million. Then we've got over £57 million to support our high needs settings across the county, and then 28 million for early years, so that's for our nursery settings. So you can see the total funding coming in is 406 million into the county. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? So in terms of where we are with the funding, again, I thought it'd be useful to share with you a table just showing how that funding has increased over the last couple of years. So we can see the funding we received in 2019 all the way through to what we'll be receiving next year. And we can see for the schools block, that funding's gone up from 275 million to this year being 293 million, and next year will be 303 million. It will actually be more than that, and the reason I'm presenting this slide in this way to you is to show the actual uplift we've got. So if we look at the schools block, we can see there's an increase of £10 million for next year. The Department for Education have also included something called the Teachers' Pay and Pension Grants, which were paid separately as separate grants to our schools. They've now decided to incorporate those into the main block of the school's funding. So for next year, we'll see an uplift in real terms, an increase of 10 million, plus on top of that, 14 million coming through, which is that Teachers' Pay and Pension Grant, which will cease because the money will come in part of the school, the school's core funding. So we can see in there the pay and pension grant element is £14 million. So in terms of our schools block, that's extra money coming through. So in essence, it's going up by £24 million. But because some of it is taken up by the pay and pension grant, I wanted to separate the two out for you there so that we can see the real uplift. So we can see the trend here, the income coming up, which is great news to see, extra funding coming into our schools. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? So this is where the good news sort of starts, really. You'll all remember there was an announcement made by the Prime Minister and a funding pledge for funding for schools. And this was 14 billion extra to come in school funding between the 2021 year and the 22-23 year. So the year we're just coming towards the end of now, there was an additional 2.6 billion went into school funding. And for next year, an additional 4.8 billion. The uplift is only 2.2 billion, the difference, because the original 2.6 will be baseline. But that's where we are. And next year is going up again by another 2.3 billion to 7.1 billion, which will take the overall schools budget funding up and down the country to £52 billion. So it's a huge uplift. It's great news to see it coming through. Does it resolve all the problems for schools and their financial issues? No, sadly it doesn't. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? So what does it mean? So looking forward into the 21-22 year, and that's the year we're all looking to at the moment, our pupil-led and school-led funding factors have increased and will increase by 3%. So that includes the per pupil funding that comes into your schools, the lump sum funding, the prior attainment funding, English as an additional language, and the deprivation funding. So all of those factors will be going up by 3%. Other premises factors that you receive, some of your schools may receive split site allowances, PFI funding, rent, sparsity, and rates funding. They will not be uplifted by 3%. It's only those core pupil-led factors and the school-led factors that will be. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? So budgets for next year, they're all based upon something called the National Funding Formula. And the National Funding Formula is the formula that the DfE set for how all local authorities should be funded, and then for passporting funding onto our schools. Our schools forum agreed a principle of moving towards the national formula. In other words, they agreed that the way the DfE are proposing to fund schools is something we would adopt. And then for next year, Cabinet, the local authorities Cabinet, agreed that was absolutely fine, and the funding formula would be in place for next year. So what we'll be doing next year is we'll be doing a transfer between the schools block and the high needs block of 1.5 million. That's a transfer of funding across to help with high needs costs. All of our school budgets were out with schools before the 28th of February. The local authority lets all maintained schools know what their funding looks like, and the DfE tell academy schools what their funding will look like. And there's an absolute deadline of the 28th of February, and all schools in Wiltshire had their budgets in advance of that date. So that was good news. In terms of the maintained schools, you're required to submit your budget templates into the local authority, and the deadline date is the 18th of June this year. For academies, you've got your budget forecast return due into the DfE directly, and that's due in by the 27th of July this year as well. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? Okay, so I thought it might be quite useful just to have a very quick canter through the key funding factors for all of our schools, just as a refresher for some of you, and some of this may be new news. So the ALPU value stands for the age-weighted pupil unit. In other words, the funding per pupil that your schools will receive. And there's different funding rates between primary schools and secondary schools, and those will be detailed on your funding certificates if you get them from the local authority, or GAG statements if they come for academy schools. There's something called the minimum per pupil funding levels, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a moment to you. But again, that's a level of funding that all schools must receive a certain level of funding through the funding formula. In our schools, you also receive deprivation funding, and this is based upon the free school meal indicator, so those pupils that are currently eligible for a free school meal. Then there's also a factor called free school meal ever 6, and that's pupils that are in your school that have been entitled to a free school meal in any of the last 6 years. And then on top of that, there's also a funding factor called the EDACHI funding, and EDACHI stands for the Index of Deprivation Affecting Children Index. So what that funds your schools for is for those pupils who live in a what is deemed to be a deprived postcode area. So pupils that live in a postcode area that sees higher levels of deprivation will attract funding into your school. We also attract funding in through prior attainment. This is for pupils who have got low attainment, and for primaries that's recorded at the early years foundation stage profile, and for secondary schools that's the progress at the end of key stage 2 as the key measure. Then we have something called English as an additional language. This is for pupils that come into schools where English is not their first language, and your school will receive funding for the first 3 years that pupil is in state education. So if a pupil comes to your school and they've already spent 2 years at another school and English is their second language, then you will only receive funding for 1 more year. There's a new factor that we've introduced for the school funding for this year. It's called mobility. And that's come in for next year. And that's for those funding for those pupils that have joined a school at the non-standard entry point. And by standard entry point, we normally mean where pupils have joined a school in September. So this is where pupils have been registered on the school census having joined the school either the May census or the January census rather than the October census. And for those schools that see a greater percentage than 6% of their school population as being mobile will in effect receive extra funding. Okay, can I have the next slide please, Claire? Thank you. Then we look at the school-led funding factors. And there's a lump sum in there. So all schools receive a lump sum. It's a flat rate of funding in recognition of that all schools have fixed costs to pay for. So every school has to have a head teacher. Every school has to have testing done, such as Legionella testing. All schools have to have health and safety provisions in place. So the DFE recognise that and therefore give every school a lump sum. There's something called sparsity funding. This is to support our small rural schools. So this is where a funding is awarded to schools where they're in primary schools less than 150 pupils on roll, in secondary less than 600 pupils on roll. And the test here is that if that school was to close, how far would it be for the pupils to get their next nearest comparable school? And in primary, if that sparsity distance is greater than 2 miles, in secondary 3 miles, then the school receives some funding that they refer to as sparsity. And I'll touch on sparsity a little bit later on this evening. We're talking about a consultation that's just come out about that funding factor. Rates, this is your business rates. Yes, schools have to pay business rates, unfortunately, but don't worry, we give you the funding to cover the business rates. So it's very, very much cost neutral for your schools. PFI, so the PFI only affects 3 of our secondary schools in the county, and we fund those schools for PFI costs on a historic basis. We have something called a split site allowance, and this is for those schools that operate over more than one site. When I say more than one site, I don't mean 2 buildings right next door to each other. I mean schools that are separate, and there must be a break between the schools, so a distance between the 2 sites of at least half a mile. And where the schools are a split site, then they receive extra funding. And that's in recognition of the fact that those schools may have to have 2 receptionists, 2 photocopiers, and so on and so forth. Then we have something called exceptional premises factors. Again, this is a funding factor which funds those schools that don't have either their own hall or their own playing fields and gives them some funding towards the cost of renting those. And it's where the cost of that rent is more than 1% of the school's annual budget. So where that's the case, then the school receives some funding to help with those costs. And then we have something called growth, and this is for where we're looking to expand schools or open brand new schools across the county. The local authority will, through the national funding formula, award extra funding to support those schools through that period of transition. Okay, come to the next slide, please, Claire. Okay, so we talked a moment ago about the minimum per pupil funding levels, and this is one that's fairly newly been introduced. It came in the 1920 year, and I just want to explain a little bit more about it because it does cause some confusion in schools. The minimum per pupil funding levels have increased. So in secondary, it moved from £4,800 to £5,000 and is now next year moving up to £5,415. Similarly, in primary, it was at £3,500 back in 1920 when it came in. This year, it's at £3,750, and next year, it's moving up to £4,180. What am I talking about? Well, what I'm talking about here is the total funding your school receives divided by the number of pupils you've got on roll, and you must be funded at these levels that we're talking about here. So for next year, that's 4,180 in a primary and 5,415 in a secondary school. And it's mandatory that we must be able to provide funding for schools at those levels. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples now so we can look at those. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? So this is a bit of a snapshot, and I apologize, it looks a bit clunky on here, but it's just to try and demonstrate to you what we're talking about. So I'm looking here at a school with 210 pupils, so a primary school. And as we work down, we can see they've got some pupils receiving deprivation for free school meals. We've got 30 of those, 45 free school meals, 6. And then in the Adachi bands, we can see we've got some pupils in there. 2 pupils with English as an additional language, and 40 pupils with prior attainment. And when we look over on the right-hand column, we can see the total income the school receives there is £861,000. When we divide that by the 210 pupils on roll, that works out at £4,104 per pupil. The minimum per pupil funding level for next year says we must fund at £4,180, which means the school should receive a total funding of £877,000. Under the formula factors, the school's only entitled to 861,000. Therefore, it needs topping up by that 16,000 at the bottom line there to bring it up to those minimum per pupil funding levels. And that's what we're talking about, making sure schools are all funded at least that level. I'm just going to show you another example on the next sheet, please, Claire, which just shows a school that's funded above those levels. So on this example now, what we can see is same 210 pupils in the school, but we can see there's a greater number of pupils attracting deprivation funding and prior attainment funding, and the school also receives 10,000 through the mobility factor as well. So the total funding this school receives is £980,400. And when I divide that by the 210 pupils on roll, that comes out at being £4,669 a pupil. That means the school is funded above the minimum per pupil funding level of £4,180. Okay, so therefore, because this school is funded above the 4,180, it doesn't get any top up. I hope that's clear for everyone. It's just to try and give you an example of how that minimum per pupil funding level works. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? Okay, so I thought it would just be useful to just recap on a few of the key changes that are going on at the moment. So broadly speaking, the funding formula for next year is similar to the one for the year we're in at the moment. So it's similar to the 2021 year, but there's a couple of key changes. So we're funding schools at the national funding formula values. So those are the values set by the DFE, which sees an increase in those pupil and school-led funding values of 3%, which is great news. The teachers' pay and pension grants are being baselined into the ORPU values. Now, what we're saying is here, between September 2019 and the end of March if you're a maintained school, the end of August if you're an academy school, schools have been receiving something called the teachers' pay and pension grants in recognition of teachers' pay awards and the uplift in pension costs for schools over the last couple of years. They have been paid as separate grants to our schools during the last couple of years. The DFE have now recognised that it's a bit ridiculous to keep paying grants each year, which relate back to previous years' teachers' pay and pension awards. Therefore, what they've done is they've baselined, so put it into the base funding, the ORPU values for your schools. So in a primary school, you've had an uplift of £180, and in secondary schools, £265 in those ORPU values to cover off those pay and pension grants, which will cease at the end of this financial year. So they'll cease for maintained schools at the end of March, cease for academy schools at the end of August, at the end of their financial year. We talked today about the ADACHI data. That's the Index of Deprivation Affecting Children Index. That is the data that's used for calculating deprivation by postcode. That data has been refreshed. It was based on 2015 data for last year's funding. It's been updated to the 2019 data for the 21-22 year. We've seen the increase in the minimum per pupil funding levels, and we've just looked at those examples. So they're going up to 4,180 in primary and 5,415 in secondary schools. We've also seen the introduction of the mobility factor. So that's a new factor coming in for next year. That's where we've got more than 6% of the pupils in a school have joined at a non-standard entry point. So not there for the October census, but arriving after that census has taken place. And the split site allowance has gone up to 90,000. So the split site allowance we applied in Wiltshire used to be 65,000. It's now at 90,000 for those schools operating over 2 sites. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? Thank you, Claire. So it wouldn't be fair to talk about funding without for schools without talking about high needs funding. So up and down the country, we've seen an extra £730 million nationally go into the pot for high needs funding. And Wiltshire's share was an extra £5 million, which is great news. Yes, it is good news. Does it provide a sustainable solution? Unfortunately, it doesn't in Wiltshire. And many of you will know that Wiltshire's in trouble with its high needs. So what we've seen is after the last couple of years, we have seen overspends on high needs. The demand for high needs across the county has been increasing at quite a high rate, and the funding hasn't kept pace. So what we've ended up in a situation is that we're overspent on high needs. And come the end of this financial year, the end of the 2021 year, we're expecting that cumulative deficit to be around £19 million. So it's a huge amount. We're not the worst in the country, we're not the best in the country, but in terms of the overall position, it's not one that we like to be in. So we are looking to take action to try and address the overspend, and Schools Forum and the Schools Forum Working Group are looking at ways of addressing that high needs overspend. And it's not driven through wanton and reckless spending, it really is the demand for high needs places across the county. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? So in terms of high needs, we saw earlier on the slide, we get about £57 million in for Wiltshire. So what does that fund? Well, that funds our special schools across the county. It funds our resource-based places in primary schools, our enhanced learning provision places in secondaries, all the top-ups associated with those high needs settings, and also our named pupil allowances. This is for pupils that have got an education healthcare plan that says that they need to have some additional support. And it also covers some of the teams from LA that provide SEN support across your schools. And associated with every pupil that has high needs and high needs funding, there's an education healthcare plan that attracts additional funding to your school. And on that education healthcare plan, referred to as the HCP, there's a band of funding that is attracted to that individual pupil. And I've put the bands in there, and it goes from a lower one all the way through to a band 4, and you can see the span of funding that is attracted into your schools. Like I said earlier, we've got 6 special school locations across the county. We've got 812 places in those schools. In terms of resource spaces, we've got 18 of those around the county with 322 places. And at 27 of our secondary schools, we've got ELP places, and that gives us 317 places. So you can see the nature of the high needs provision that's across the county for helping pupils that have got SEN. Okay, can I have the next slide, please, Claire? So in terms of those funding rates, what we've got is the same across all settings. So all of our schools would receive the same values, whether you're in the north of the county or the south of the county. It's the same rates that we put in place. Our resource bases and our ELPs, the enhanced learning provision in secondaries, receive something called place funding. So any school that's got a resource base or an ELP provision receives place funding, and that's determined by the DFE. The DFE set how much we pay out as place funding, and that's £6,000 per place. So those schools get some extra funding to help with the costs of those places. So in terms of the top-up rates that we then pay to schools, is you get schools will receive that have got resource base receive the place funding and then a top up for each pupil, and the top up will be determined by those bandings that are on the screen in front of you. If we then had pupils with an NPA, a named pupil allowance in your school, you don't receive a place funding of £6,000. It is just a top up for those pupils. Okay, they just receive the top up element. So I've put 2 examples at the bottom there. So a pupil registered in a resource space with a band upper 1 would attract top up funding of £4,067. So we can see band upper 1, £4,067, plus there's place funding at the school of £6,000 for the resource based place. So that's £10,067. Where the pupil has what they call a named pupil allowance, and that's what's determined on their education healthcare plan, and have a band of upper 1, they would only attract the £4,067. Okay, they don't get the place funding as well because they're just a named pupil allowances on their education healthcare plan. Whereas the pupil that's in the resource base, they get the place funding plus the top up. Okay, can we have the next slide, please, Claire? Okay, without going any further, I want to touch on notional SEN funding. And notional SEN funding is something that causes a lot of confusion amongst colleagues in schools, colleagues at the local authority as well. So don't think I'm saying that this is an easy topic. There's something called notional SEN funding, and this is an amount of money that's identified on your school's funding certificate, or for academies your GAG statement, that's there to contribute towards the costs of any special educational provision for children with SEN or disabilities in your schools. And within your funding statement, when it comes through, you will see a section on it that sets out what that notional SEN funding is. It's not extra funding that comes into your school, it's a proportion of your overall budget that is deemed to be notional SEN funding. Okay, so it's not extra money, it's just part of your existing funding. And what that funding is there for is to to enable a school to provide towards the cost of SEN in your school. So basically what it means is that of the ORPU funding, the basic funding you receive per pupil, a proportion of that funding should be set aside for notional SEN. A proportion of deprivation funding should be towards notional SEN. And of your prior attainment funding your school receives, again, that is deemed to be towards notional SEN. And on your funding certificate, you'll see a box a little bit like the one that's on the screen at the moment that sets out the breakdown of that notional SEN funding. Okay, so for this particular school's example, and this was a primary school when I copied over, there's £84,500 of funding within the school's overall funding that is deemed to be there to provide for notional SEN. In other words, to provide for the first element of funding for those pupils with SEN. Claire, can I have the next screen, please? So what does the DFE guidance say about notional SEN funding? Well, what the DFE guidance says is that schools are expected to use that notional SEN budget to meet the needs of pupils with high incidence SEN and also to contribute towards the cost of provision for high needs pupils. And what that means is schools are expected to fund the first £6,000 worth of high needs provision for all pupils in the school with SEN. So in other words, within that, the total quantum of funding that you receive as a school, part of that budget is deemed to be notional SEN, and that is supposed to be used to cover the first £6,000 worth of any high needs required to put a provision in place for a pupil with SEN. Okay. On top of the notional SEN funding, you then receive the top-up funding associated with pupils, whether it's through a named pupil allowance or if you've got a resource base, then you'll be getting the place funding and the top-up as well. Notional SEN funding is never an easy one to get your head around. We've got lots of colleagues out in schools that struggle with this concept. So I'm sorry I run through that very, very quickly. But the key point in here is schools receive the notional SEN budget. It's part of your core funding, and you're expected to use that to cover the first £6,000 worth of any provision you need to put in place for pupils with SEN. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? Okay, very quick breather. Right, let's move on to something different now. We're going to look at budget planning. It's very topical because it usually takes place between February and June each year, and that's where we are at the moment. So next slide, please, Claire. Okay, so what are the sources of income that come into your school? I thought this was quite useful just to sort of a quick run through. You got your funding certificate income. We went through the main funding factors a little bit earlier. Then we've got pupil premium that comes in as a separate grant. We just talked a moment ago about other income, and we've got here named pupil allowance income for those pupils with SEN. There could be some high needs top-up funding if you've got a resource space. Then there's pupil growth funding for those schools that are expanding or being asked to expand by the local authority or growing as of their size. Then there's government grants as well. So the Universal Infant Free School Meal Grant, the PE grant, the Teachers Pay and Pension Grant, which we know is ceasing at the end of this year. I put COVID-19 funding on, and we will touch on some COVID-19 in a moment. Then you've got other income coming in, such as lettings, bank interest. I probably ought to take that one off because there's not a lot of interest about these days from the banks. Donations, contributions, and breakfast and after school clubs as well. In terms of capital funding, schools receive something called formula capital. So that comes in from the DFE via the local authority or from the DFE straight to academy schools. And there's also capital bids that can be put in as well. So capital bids can come into the local authority, or what we call SIF bids that go into the DFE for academy schools. And also schools have their balances that they carry forward each year. So you roll forward your revenue reserve. Okay, the next slide, please, Claire. So in terms of income, some key updates here for you. Just to remember, and I am reiterating this point time and time again, the Teachers Pay and Pension grants are ceasing at the end of this current financial year. Our ORPU rates, so the per pupil funding rates, have been uplifted by £180 in primary, £265 in secondary, to baseline those Teachers Pay and Pension grants into your core funding, and that's really good news. And again, that's been reflected in the minimum per pupil funding levels, which have also increased by that £180 and £265 as well, to make sure that they're captured too. Pupil premium, there's been a slight change in this one. So it was always based upon the January census for the following year. So in other words, the pupil premium for the 21-22 year would traditionally be based on the January census. The DFE have now moved the goalpost slightly, and they're now going to use the October census, not the January census, as the driver for pupil premium. So your pupil premium for the 21-22 year will be based on the October 20 census. PE grant for primary schools, we're just awaiting confirmation from the DfE. I have posed the question to them about the PE grant going forwards. I think any government that removed funding for PE grant would be frowned upon quite significantly for doing so. So I'm expecting that to continue. COVID income, there's a lot of uncertainty around COVID income and what's coming into schools from COVID. And again, I'll touch on that in a moment. And also we're making an assumption. We're moving into year 2 of the 3-year 14 billion pledge. So moving into year 2 of that. There's year 3 still to come, and we're making an assumption that school funding will be increased by 2% into the 22-23 year. So that's our assumptions we're making. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? So now looking at expenditure, so what have we got in terms of expenditure? We've got payroll costs. Biggest cost to any school is staffing. So payroll costs are your biggest cost in school. And we've got staff contracts, pay awards, increments, on costs, so that's your national insurance and your pension contributions. Also apprenticeship levy in there. So schools have to contribute towards the apprenticeship levy. Then we've got premises and grounds maintenance costs, any capital projects, utilities in schools, educational supplies, admin costs, IT, insurance costs, catering, right choice services for your school and any other services for your school as well. And then trying to implement your school development or school improvement plan costs as well. So those are the main costs that the schools are seeing each year as well. Claire, can I have the next slide, please? So just in terms of some key updates on expenditure, I'm sure you've all heard about the public sector pay freeze for next year. So what does that mean in terms of budgeting for everyone? What that means is from the teachers' pay side of things, all that we'll see for teachers is increments only going through. So there'll be no cost of living pay award at all. I'm sure you are all aware that there's been a move by the government towards putting teachers' starting salaries up to 30,000 as the base starting point, and that's been paused for next year. So there's no movement towards that next year. So we're only expecting increments only, so where teachers are shifting up through the pay scales. Similarly for support staff as well, but for support staff, what we're expecting is that there'll be a slight uplift. For those staff that earn less than 24,000 per annum, the government have put forward a £250 uplift in the pay for those staff earning less than that. And most of our support staff do earn less than 24,000 in schools. So what we're modelling through from a budget point of view is a 1% uplift in support staff costs for next year. So even though we're not seeing a cost of living increase, because we've got that £250 uplift for all those support staff earning less than 24,000, we'll model that through as a 1% uplift. And then for all other costs, we're expecting inflation of around about 1%. The RPI keeps bobbing around below 1%, above 1%. So we're thinking 1% is a reasonable figure to be using. But I've also put in there for expenditure items, COVID expenditure, and you will know better than anyone else in your schools that COVID costs have been very unpredictable this year in terms, or over the last year, in terms of what schools have had to incur. And that goes from everything from additional costs around PPE, supply stuff, all the way through to losing income as well, such as loss of lettings and things like that. Okay, can I have the next slide, please, Claire? Okay, I said I'd give you a quick COVID update. So these are the things that we know about at the moment. So the COVID Workforce Fund, now this was announced, believe it or not, before Christmas, and this was to cover staff absenteeism, significant staff absenteeism, between the November half term and the end of the Christmas term. And the DfE haven't yet put their claims process out, so schools haven't been able to claim for those absenteeism costs. We are expecting that out anytime soon, and as soon as that's out, we'll make sure your schools are made aware through Right Choice. Then we've got something called the COVID catch-up premium. A lot was made of catch-up premium last year, and the first tranche came out before Christmas. The second tranche, which covers up until the Easter holidays, that came out last week, so all your schools have had the second tranche. And you'll recall that was funding of £80 per pupil in mainstream school and £240 for pupils in special schools. And then very recently, so on the 25th of February, there was an announcement, what I thought was going to be called Catch-Up Premium 2, but it's actually been called Recovery Premium. And there's a link on the slides that comes out to you to that announcement. So what does that actually mean? Well, what the DfE are proposing is another £300 million in for primary and secondary schools. And they've said an average primary school will receive £6,000, an average secondary £22,000. We all know in Wiltshire we haven't got average schools, we've got above average schools, and that's it. So I'd love to think we're getting more than that, but no, what they're talking about is average size here. So that's what they're referring to. So given the nature of our schools in Wiltshire, no school is going to get exactly 6 or 22, but that gives you a feel for the amount of funding that's coming through. They're also putting another £200 million into tutoring, so that's the National Tutoring Programme, and also £200 million for summer schools in secondary, so that's to deliver face-to-face sessions in secondary schools. The DfE also funded exceptional costs, and this was last year. Crikey, wind the clock back nearly a year ago now. The DfE announced that they would fund exceptional costs for the summer term, so between March and the end of July. This was to cover extra free school meal costs, cleaning costs in schools, and premises costs as well. And they've now paid all of those, so they have closed the claims window now, and all of those costs have now been paid over to schools. So wherever your school may have claimed for some of those exceptional costs, you should have had that funding through by now. The F40 campaign group, now this is a campaign group that the local authority belongs to. F40 standing for the worst funded authorities up and down the country, the 40 worst funded authorities that is, and they've been fighting for additional funding to help with COVID costs in schools and also lost income in schools. And we did ask all your schools to provide some case studies of extra costs and lost income that you'd had in your schools, and we had an outstanding response to that. We had a really good response to that request, and that information was all shared with the F40 group, who then used our template to go and ask other schools up and down the country to submit their information too. And the DfE are taking note of all those requests that have come through. So where we've been able to establish what the extra costs are, then the DfE has shown real interest, and they wanted to know what is the real cost. So thank you to all your schools that did respond to that request for information. Just one final one in terms of COVID. On your school website, so all schools are required now to publish details of what you've spent your catch-up premium on, how much you've received and what your plans are for spending. That's supposed to be on your school website, okay? That's a very recent update, but I think just one worth sharing with you as well. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? So we've got 2 consultations that are out at the moment. Sorry, moving off COVID now. 2 consultations that are out at the moment. So the first one I put more for information, and there's a consultation that came out a couple of weeks ago about reviewing how the DfE plan to allocate high needs funding to local authorities for the 22-23 year. And having had a look through there, it doesn't look particularly favourable for Wiltshire. That consultation closes on the 24th of March this year, and our colleagues are looking at what that means for the local authority. We'll be presenting something to Schools Forum this week on that topic. But the next consultation is when I've put more for action, and this is consultation regarding support for small and rural schools, the sparsity factor, which we touched on earlier. So in terms of calculating the sparsity funding, it's for small schools, so primary schools less than 150 pupils, secondaries less than 600 pupils. And what the DfE say is, what is the average distance a child would have to travel to get to their next nearest school? And traditionally they've used as the crow flies as their model. Well, no child travels to school on the back of a crow, we all know that. But what they're saying is they've now realized that actually that's not a great way of doing it, and they should use road distances, because actually if we're looking at the distance a family may have to travel to take their child to school, they're going to have to take them on road. They're not going to necessarily take them across the fields and whatever else. So they're looking at changing how they use the method for calculating the distances to road distances instead. They're also looking to put the funding up by another 10k in terms of the allocations. That consultation closed on the 9th of April, and we are working on an LA response to this one, which we will publish on Right Choice, so that your schools can use that to help inform some of their responses too. But we would encourage you to take a good look at that consultation. There's only, I think there's, from memory, it's about 7 or 8 questions on it. It's quite a short, sweet, simple to complete consultation, that one, and the link is there to that consultation. But again, we will put out the local authorities response so that schools can see that, and then you can use that perhaps to inform your own judgments too. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? Okay, we're coming up to the end of my session, and we're just talking here about the school's financial value standard. This is for maintained schools. So this is a self-assessment tool, and the amount of evidence you have to provide for this isn't actually prescribed. But there's been a new format that came into SFVS back in the 1920 year, and it's basically a checklist over 7 areas. So there's 29 questions over those 7 areas, and a dashboard which gives you lots of statistical data about your school and gives you the opportunity to put in some of your own raw data as well to come up with some RAG ratings. And so it's a really useful tool to use. Your responses are due in by the 31st of March. So it's just a bit of a reminder on there that that's due in. And for academy schools, Claire, can I have the next slide, please? There's something called the School Resource Management Self-Assessment Tool, very similar to SFVS. Again, it's a self-assessment. The level of evidence you have to provide isn't actually prescribed, but this one must be signed off by the chair of your trust board. Again, very similar to SFVS, the new format was introduced in 1920, a checklist of questions, a dashboard on there to give you statistical information. It is a really, really useful tool on there. So that's for the academy schools, and yours is due in by the 15th of April directly to the DFE. And can I have the next slide, please, Claire? Okay, folks, that's the end of my rambling on for you. I'm sure there are some questions out there, and I'd be more than happy to take any of those questions if that's how we want to take things forward. I'm conscious I may have overrun a little bit, Claire, so I don't know whether you want to leave the question in the chat and pass them over and I can respond to them individually, or we want to take them live.
Grant, thank you very much. That's very informative. I think that we'd like to take the questions. I think there's quite a few in the chat.
Okay.
Can you see the chat window?
Oh, yes, I can. Yes, right. Okay. Right. Okay. Shall I start back? Oh, cannot hear. That's okay. We can hear now. Okay. Are the slides going to be circulated? Yes, they are going to be out, aren't they, Claire?
Yeah, they are. We'll send them straight out after this.
Okay. Okay. Just going through. Right, okay. Latest Wiltshire, right. The Adachi data, so this from Stella. Stella, thanks for the question. Are you able to provide the latest Wiltshire national Adachi distributions for primary schools? Yes, I can do. The Adachi stats and information comes into the local authority directly from the DFE. So they tell us what the Adachi is for each individual school, and we use that as part of the funding formula. So if you want to know it for just your school, that should be on your funding certificate. If you want to know it for all schools in Wiltshire, please do email me separately and we can have a conversation about it if that's all right. My email is at the end there. It's just grant.davis@wiltshire.gov.uk. Okay. Okay. High needs, yeah, high needs is an overspend area. The high needs block of funding has come under increasing pressure over the last few years, and this is a national problem, not just a Wiltshire problem. What we've seen is the number of education and healthcare plans quite literally rocket upwards. The funding has never kept a pace, and since the introduction of the Children and Families Act back in 2014, it expanded the numbers of pupils that were entitled to funding through the EHCP process. So it used to be 5 to 16-year-olds, it's now 0 to 25-year-olds. So you can see the age gap was hugely extended. The funding didn't keep a pace, and every authority up and down the country is experiencing an overspend on their high needs block. Some a lot worse than others. So Wiltshire's expecting to be at about 19 million in deficit, and not that this makes it any better, but colleagues in Surrey are over 70 million in deficit, of a similar scale to Wiltshire. So we know it's going on up and down the country, and the DFE are promising to look into this. There's a proposal for a full-blown review of SEN funding to take place during the 22-23 year to inform the 23-24 year. So I hope not to be bringing bad news about high needs funding in the future. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And the schools forum have details of exactly where the where the high needs situation sits. Jeremy, thanks for your question. So in terms of school funding certificates, how are they issued out to schools? They come out securely for each individual school. So they come out on something called Perspective Light. Your school business manager will have a copy. It will download that securely for your school and have that ready for your next governor meeting or to pass over to governors in due course. It really heralds the start of the budgeting process. There's also a whole raft of budget information that comes out. That comes out on the right choice. And again, if any of you haven't got access to Right Choice, your school business managers in your school can set you up with access to Right Choice, and you can see a whole raft of information. So we put out on Right Choice all of the school budget information, all our assumptions on there, what the individual funding factors are, how they're all calculated, what they mean for your schools. And again, that's all there on the Right Choice for you to have a look at your leisure. But your actual funding certificate, it comes through something called Perspective Light because it needs to be securely delivered for your school. Academy schools, yours comes directly from the DFE, and that'll come directly to your school in a secure format as well. Okay. Has the position improved for how funding? Sorry.
Hello. Sorry.
Has the position improved? Sorry, Jeremy, were you speaking? Sorry, that interrupted you. Sorry.
That's right. So when in the year is the funding certificate released? It's soon.
It came out for maintained schools. They came out on the 9th of February, so they may just come out. So just before half term they came out. So they usually, our plan is to release them and get them ready for you by the half term. So usually about the 14th of February. Nice Valentine's gift for everyone. That's our aim to get them out about then. They came out on the 9th this year, so that was slightly earlier. So they should be in all of your schools now.
Okay, thank you.
No worries at all. Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, question from Mark. Has the position improved regarding how funding for Wiltshire schools compared to the rest of the country? Well, actually on this one, Mark, yes, I suppose it has. But since we've moved to the national funding formula for how we fund all our schools, there's national rates that the DFE propose and they put forward. And the majority of local authorities, over 75% of local authorities, now use those national values. There's some authorities that haven't moved to the national formula for various reasons. It could have been their existing formula they had previously. They felt that was more appropriate. But the majority of authorities are moving across to the national formula values. Eventually, what will happen, and I suspect it'll be the 23-24 year, maybe 24-25, the DFE will say, we're not going to give money to local authorities any longer to fund schools. We're going to fund schools directly, and it will be these values. So in other words, make that the funding formula, the values, a hard formula. So therefore, we're not letting anyone have any discretion. These are the values that will be imposed. So that's how things are going to move going forwards. So there will be complete parity up and down the country then. So yes, so that is good. And from Wiltshire's perspective, that's been good news because we were always very poorly funded. So we are seeing ourselves move towards a much better state of funding. Okay. Can I ask the plan for using Section 106 monies to support existing school infrastructure capital projects? I'm probably not your best person to ask about that one, Brian. My colleague at the local authority, lady called Clara Davies, is probably the best person to speak to. If you want to drop me a line afterwards, I'll get her details across to you. That would be absolutely fine. More than happy to share those with her. She's far more involved in the sort of planning for schools than I am. Okay. Should schools submit their SFES to local authority no later than the 28th of May? Yes. As soon as you've got them ready, Adrian, that would be perfect. We do say the 31st of March. I'm not aware the DFE have moved that deadline. They may well have done. They did last year. I know they did. But yes, as soon as it's ready, please do let us have it. We do collect them in, and we do work through those as well. So that'd be really useful to have those in as soon as possible. But I fully understand why some schools may have delays in there. We all know where we are with that one. Okay. Sparsity distances, Chris. Yeah, the distances for sparsity is 2 miles for primary schools, 3 miles for secondary schools. And that distance is, if you can imagine your school closed, what's the average distance a child would have to travel to get to their next nearest school? So that's how they calculate it. At the moment, they're doing as the crow flies, and the proposal through the consultation is to change that to road distance. So particularly in some areas like, for example, Yorkshire Dales, Lake District and things, that would be quite a significant distance. that would move. I've done some quick analysis for Wiltshire, just so you're aware. We've currently got about 29 schools that receive sparsity funding. If we were to implement the proposals that the DFE are suggesting using road distances, that would take the number of schools receiving extra funding up to 52. So there's quite a significant shift there. So it's something that I think we'll be in favour of. The downside of sparsity funding is that it doesn't mean that all of our small rural schools still gain, because some schools may be close to another school so that the average distance isn't above that 2-mile threshold. So like I say, we'll put something out on Right Choice for you to see on that one for the local authorities response. Okay. What else have we got in there? Okay. Okay, that's fine. Yes, if you send that through to me by email. I think that's all the questions I've been through. David, unless you know of any others that I haven't done, and thank you for answering a few, David, along the way, which that's really helpful. I think that's them all through there, Claire.
Brilliant. Well, Grant, it just remains for me to say thank you very much for being with us this evening. As always, you really tell us how it is, and I always learn something new every time you share something with us. And thank you very much for agreeing to take those offline questions as well. That is really very much appreciated. So thank you for all you do to help support our schools.
Thank you very much, Claire. Anytime, and like I say, if anyone's got any questions, please do just send them through. That's absolutely fine. Thank you very much.
And we will be distributing these slides straight after this meeting, so people will be able to follow those links that you've put in the presentations.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Grant.
Thank you.
So just following on, just a few things from me about WGA. So over this last year, in terms of moving to different ways of working, really, we've been working with AJ within Wiltshire Council to look at how we work more in conjunction with Wiltshire Council to best support the governing body across Wiltshire in what can only be described as an even harder job, I think, for us all as volunteers to lead in schools. So going forward, our Chairs Forum, which I know many of you have joined historically on a Saturday morning in Devizes, we're going to be widening that and calling that a Governor Leadership Forum. And that's for a number of different reasons. We think that leadership happens across all aspects of the governing board, and we feel that it's important to grow that leadership piece. And a number of you have asked us to look at that over the last couple of years. We still want to ultimately move back to having that face-to-face meeting, and we will have to potentially look at a different location in Devizes, but we want to ask you about how we continue or move to using different remote type meeting forums as we all move to this new norm. So over the next few weeks, we would like to come out to you and ask you what you want from the WGA and from our meetings and types of events. In terms of our working more closely with Wiltshire Council, we have been working through an updated constitution, which we will present to you in the autumn as part of our annual meeting. And linked with that will be an MOU for working with Wiltshire Council. But for both organisations, the importance is about maintaining that independent voice for governors across Wiltshire. The Wiltshire Council want that to happen as much as we do on the WGA board. But we want to work together more on joint projects to help with that governing challenge that we know that you all experience. So one of the areas that we have been looking at jointly is about the is to support governor recruitment, because it is likely that the central support to governor recruitment from DFE is going to end. It's not. It is not definitely known that that is going to happen. There is just some feeling that that is going to happen, and looking at some of the successes, there is also some conversations that local recruitment, local to the area, will help to support governor recruitment. But again, that's a joint project where we will come and ask you, what are you looking for? What do you need? And lastly, please use the chat to help us with this. What do you want from the WGA? What else would help you with that challenge of being a governor? And that might be about the type of events, or the types of speakers, or the types of areas that are concerning you, either as a governor or in your governing body. Myself and the board are all active in the governor's space, but we are here to represent and support you, and we need to know what you need. So please help us to help you, either, as I say, by using the chat now, or by emailing through emailing us directly, or picking up the phone, or using one of the forums that some of you are involved with through Wiltshire Council. Any way you want to speak to us or communicate with us, it is fine. But ultimately, we're here to support you, and we want to make this work going forward. The job isn't going to get any easier, and we don't want to lose any of you along the way. As I say, please help us to help you. So I don't know, we've overrun slightly. I'm sure you've all got family that you need to go to this evening. So David, is there anything you would like to add?
No, that's fine. I've put my email address into the chat. We've been asked to do some support on the governor recruitment, which is good, and looking at the onboarding of new governors and the induction toolkit, which is quite positive. That's great.
So before I close, is there any comments that anybody would like to make before we close? Okay, well, it just remains for me to say thank you to David for organising this. Any feedback is welcome. Thank you to Grant again for giving up his time. We'll look forward to welcoming you to another event, and I hope you have a good rest of the evening. And I hope your schools have had a good first day today, and that they're all safe and sound for the rest of the week. Thank you very much.
There's about 15 people left on at the moment. But Grant, I just wanted to say that was really, really excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, David. No, I really enjoyed it. It's so different doing it in a session where it's a non-classroom based type event. You know, when we've done it before in the Corn Exchange and Devices, you can almost read the room a little bit. You can sort of see questions coming. You can see a rolling of eyes sometimes when people don't understand things and whatnot. But when we do a session like this, it's very difficult because you don't see the audience. But there's there's always a lot of information to share, particularly this time of year. So always happy to come and support David, and the same to you, Claire. If ever there's a topic you want discussing, I mean, I threw in some areas this evening that are probably we could have spent all night on, such as notional SEN and SEN funding, but I think it's good to give everyone a little bit of a flavour of what it all means. And even if they only pick up a few messages from the session, at least they've taken something back with them. So but yeah, I thought it was great. I mean, loads of people on the event, and good seeing the questions coming through as well, and people that know how to ask the questions and feel quite comfortable doing so. That's good.
There were 63 people, and not a single one left until you'd finished your input. Seriously, I watched. So that is quite stunning.
Oh, crikey! They were waiting for, and this is where the money's coming from. Yeah. Oh dear, that's brilliant. Yeah.
Excuse me, am I too late to ask a question? Sorry.
No, far away.
You were talking earlier about the sparsity factor and about the potential changes and so on. I was also wondering whether, when you're talking about the nearest school, I mean, we're a primary school and we're a faith school, and would it just be the distance to the next nearest primary school itself, or the next nearest primary school of the same faith as ourselves?
It would probably just be the next nearest primary school. Laura, which school are you?
St George's in Warminster.
In Warminster, it would probably just be the next school. Bear with me. So I've probably got access to the data as we're talking. Bear with me. I'm going to ask you a question now, but I don't expect you to answer it. Do you know your DFE number? Don't worry if you don't. No, that's a no, isn't it? Don't worry, that's all right. You'll find out in a minute. I'll tell you. Let's have a look. St George's. That's your DFE number 5207. You'll never forget it now. 5207. Right. Okay. Let's have a look. Your sparsity distance is half of a mile, so I'm guessing that means no. It just means the next nearest primary school for you. Yeah. Yeah, sorry about that one. Again, similarly for secondary schools, it applies in the same way that it's just the next nearest secondary school. It doesn't differentiate between any faith or anything else in there. So yeah, so unfortunately, you wouldn't receive any sparsity funding. And to be fair, whilst you're on the phone about it, Laura, and I know colleagues have their own views about it, is that whilst a school can be rural and small, we can have schools that are quite close, say like yours might be, to another school, but that doesn't mean that you haven't got the same problems another rural school might have. Do you see what I mean? So sometimes I don't always feel that funding is necessarily the fairest way of distributing funding, and